All right, hello again. So today we're going to discuss an idea of Mr. Plato here again. As we can see, Plato is again pointing towards the sky, towards the heavens, and the higher notions of humanity. So the way Plato used to describe kind of an odd concept is he used to explain it as though through horses and horseness. So let's start with the way we perceive things today. So the way we look at things generally today is that there was a time where there was no language. Animals like horses existed. We've seen said animals. We notice there's a lot of animals that are very similar to one another, that look somewhat, have the same characteristics as this horse. And we built a category called horse. So we have one horse. And then eventually, uh, and again, this is how we see it today. Uh, this became horse-ness. We sort of have this idea in our head of like what elements of this horse can change. So it can change to different color. It can be a white horse or a black horse, and it's still a horse. But if we have a white horse with black stripes, then it's no longer a horse. Then it's a zebra. And if the neck gets longer or some other characteristic changes, it might change from a horse to another animal. So there might be some sort of speciation between, depending on all sorts of variables. Plato kind of saw this differently. So Plato used to say that the most important aspect of this was the horseness itself. And he sort of had this idea that it was more generative, so creative. And we are the thing that is the most important and the thing that matters in this whole situation is the concept of horseness, of which there is this continuum of horses that fit into it. And that doesn't make, or at least I can't find a way to make it like make really clear sense without giving a different example. So this is the way I'll explain it. So there's different things in the world that look somewhat like triangles, squares, and circles. Obviously, a bubble or something like suds on the top of your water would look like circles. We have examples of squares here. We have examples of triangles throughout the natural world. And it doesn't seem like we base our perfect triangle so much on what we see in the natural world. We seem to have a concept in our head already of a perfect triangle, of which we're trying to make things fit into our concept of this equilateral triangle. Here we have perfect sides, equivalent of all, and then the perfect circle as well, that same sort of idea. And when we look at things in the natural world, we want this to fit this perfect concept we have in our head. So if you're going to buy this chunk of pyrite, if say it just had this piece right here, which is a little bit elongated, it wouldn't be as much as if it wouldn't be worth as much money as it would be if it was a perfect cube. If it's a perfect cube, they're worth more money. People will know they can charge more for them. And that sort of alludes at the fact that we're not really observing and then categorizing. We sort of have something we're fitting the natural world into. So it's the other way around. It's not really the way that we try to. I mean, you could say that there's different aspects of the same direction. And keep in mind, there is always two ways to explain this, and we're going to talk about that next lesson. But so try not to be overly kind of blood drawn to this other concept of, well, we can explain it away with this. Just hear me out here. So the fact that we're fitting all this stuff into these categories makes it believe that it's in the mind first, and then we're just looking for it in the natural world. And shapes can be constructed in something like a contemporary example of a video game and made into something that looks very much like a real scene. And these are rather crude shapes, right? They're just triangles, and some of these are smaller than others, but you get a pretty good idea of the shape of the building and the shape of the landscape behind it. And these are called polygons, and then you can just construct it, and depending on how many vertexes are on the polygons, you can make something that looks very realistic, and you can have something that looks really rather crude, but still you get the general idea. And This gets into an idea that's been around a lot of times in history, and people have often talked about which one of these is more important. And let's actually start on the bottom here. We sort of perceive the world as there's a reality which we have in our head. So this is what some people call absolute reality, and there's manifest reality. And actually, this already alludes to what we're going to talk about. But we sort of see the material things as there without us being involved in it. So it's there before we even were around, and then we just came along afterwards and sort of categorized it. But most people, or a lot of people in history, didn't find it that way. And a lot of the times when there was unionization of ideas, they put it in the other way. So they put material secondary. So they put this absolute reality above material reality. An example of this is essence function in ancient China. So this was during a period that was there was a lot of tumultuous times before it, a lot of chaos, and then this was sort of what came out of it, and this was like a unionization of all the ideas, and they brought it all together, and this was sort of a positive, viewed as a positive time in China's history. And try to ignore. I think I'm going to assume it's a U, not the O. I got this two different ways here. But T and Yang do not represent two separate things, such as absolute reality and concrete reality. They are always two flexibly viewed aspects of a single thing. So they are one thing, but the important thing is what is primary. And as we look in this example, material is secondary. We see the world as though material is primary. But I wonder if we shouldn't see it this other way. And if you want to understand all these divergent ideas and actually have them come together into one cohesive and coherent um, belief system, it has to be this way. It doesn't make any sense this way. Things as separate, as if you understand one element divorced from other elements, then matter over mind is very appealing, and it can explain things very well, and that's what basically scientific structure is based on. But if you want to understand everything conclusively, it needs to be the other way around. And I'll give you some examples where that's true. So probably the best time in history we're in right now for evidence as far as it being true. As far as material evidence for it, I guess you could say, or observational or experimental evidence. But what they call this is the observer and experimenter effect. So the best example of this is the example we already gave of the two slits experiment where they're firing photons through either of these slits. And if they fire a whole bunch of them at once, there's going to be an interference pattern on the wall. And I know we talked about this already, but we'll just go over it really quick again. But what happens is if they have two slits open and they just fire one photon at a time, they still get this interference pattern. So even though there's nothing to interfere on the other side, and they're just going through one photon at a time, they are still somehow interfering with each other. And it doesn't seem to be time dependent. It seems to be when they're observed is when they'll be fall into one of these possibilities. And if you close one of these, the effect goes away. And like, I mean, at the same time, you're just firing in one at a time. But if this is open, then even though there's still only one going through the one side, you get this effect, whereas if this is closed, you don't. So the only logical explanation to really support that could be true is that what they say is that since light is both wave and particle, that they're sort of both true at once. So until they're observed, they're actually in both slits. And then once they get observed, the wave function collapses, and then you'll observe it either one of the slit or the other slit. But they fall into this overall pattern of interference pattern, even though they're only going through one particle at a time. And Schrodinger's cat was supposed to be a thought experiment supporting this. And for whatever reason, this is the one that everybody kind of remembers when they talk about this stuff. But in this thought experiment, Schrodinger put a cat in a box, and there was a 50-50 chance of this sort of radioactive vial being broken, and then we would have killed the cat. And they say they were kind of questioning whether the cat is alive or dead. what they came to, if this is the truth, what has been observed so many times now, then the cat is both alive and dead. There's a 50-50 chance of either. So he's half alive, half dead. And then when it is being observed, is when the wave function collapses, and one of those two realities is true. But the important thing is that we influence that reality. So let's drop that for now. That's kind of on its own idea. Let's add to this though, and let's talk about random number generators. So random number generators were placed in concert halls and in sporting events. And random number generator, we'll just, for simplicity's sake, we'll say there's just zeros and ones. So what you would expect is 50% of the time there would be a 0, and 50% of the time there would be a 1. And what they found is these random number generators that are detached from the actual people, like they're just working on their own, they will leave randomness during exciting parts of the concert or the play or the movie or whatever it is. And this is also true for sporting events. So it will leave the randomness at those moments, and it won't be 50-50 anymore. It will go off of it. And the term that we use for some of these observer effects also is qualia, and that's something you'll be able to look up. We talked about this in Life of Pi. So in Life of Pi, Pi saw his life, and when he was really depressed, he saw it as sort of like the irrational numbers that just get generated forever, go nowhere, and just continuously replicate throughout millions and millions of times forever and ever. And then when he was in the boat and the boat came to the shore, it was 277 days that he was at sea, and apparently pi rationalized is 2/77. So it's showing that although things seem like they're all these irrational things, there's something bigger going on here that is not just random. It's not just this random stuff. And a good example in my own life is I play cards a lot. The person that I play cards with, the way it works is you'd expect 50%. We're about the same, I'd say we're about the same level of capability, but it seems like it never goes 50-50. Depending on the day that we're playing, whatever it is, there's times where I'll go like 10 games in a row where I'll win every single game, and then there'll be times where she goes 10 games in a row where she'll win every single game. Which, I mean, the probability and the chances of that are very slim. And again, you could explain it by, okay, you expect to lose, so you make small mistakes, everything else, but there's maybe something else there to it as well. So try not to jump on the opportunity to say, okay, it could be that as well. And I'll give you examples where that will be very hard to explain away. What they've also found with these random number generators, that intentionality. So whether you want some different event to happen, so whether you want a 0 or a 1 to show up, and if you put your intention on one of these two numbers, that also affects. So it's not that we're just, the machine is reacting to us. We're influencing this. And Rhonda Byrne here is, I mean, a lot of people just kind of scoff at what she did, but I don't see any issues with it at all. And I think that her book, although it's not going to work for everybody for the reason we've already mentioned, that some people aren't going to believe in the possibility of this, and your belief going into it and your observation is very paramount to the success or failure of it. And this comes down to basically faith, right? So people always talked about the importance of faith in religions and everything else, and maybe we were missing something by not realizing the importance of faith and our belief in one event is going to be successful or another event is not going to be successful. That intention and that belief is important. Example of this is dowsing. So dowsing was around throughout Europe and North America and for centuries, and people really believed in it and believed that these guys, I should say that they look for groundwater so people can build wells, and they did this by following their stick, and they'd be able to sort of sense what they believed. They would kind of clear their mind, and they would try to find out where groundwater was by sort of following the intention of what the stick seemed to want to do. And there was lots of studies about this, and a lot of the studies found that it was just random chance, that they weren't actually capable of finding it, but they were just randomly having success, and they were able to look in places where there were more likely to be water just by looking at context cues. But keep in mind, your belief affects this, whether it is random chance or not. So if you have a bunch of very skeptical scientists looking at this, the fact that they're observing it could make a difference. We can see some of these psychosomatic effects, so psychological and affecting the entire body, with things such as placebo and nocebo. So somebody gives you a starch pill or a sugar pill, and you'll have whatever you believe to be a positive effect from this fake pill, and then sometimes you'll have a negative effect from this fake pill. So something negatively happens that they told you something you had to worry about. And these things really happen. Like, it really would happen to the body. Some of these really extreme reactions, either negative or positive, from just a basic pill, but to your mind. And I remember reading about people that were doing this with drugs as well, and they were told that they were given one type of drug that was supposed to have a downer effect, and then they were actually given a drug that was an upper effect, and they would still have the downer effect based on somebody that was they trusted. So if you believe in science, you're obviously going to believe this, or I shouldn't say science, you believe in our medical system and the fact that pharmaceuticals are very effective, your effect is going to be really strong with this, because you trust those people that are giving you the advice. And this is something that we'll find with a few other examples here as well. A really good example is schizophrenia, and just to remind everybody, schizophrenia is when you sort of have personalities that are divergent from one another. So one might be, you could be a 30-year-old, let's say a man, 30-year-old man, and then one of his personalities could be a 10-year-old boy. One of his personalities could be a tough 25-year-old street thug. One of his personalities could be a 70-year-old, somebody that likes to garden in his front yard and is retired. Who knows? But what they found in this is that some of these switches have immediate responses of the physical body, so the material body. An example of this is one personality was allergic to orange juice while another was not. Hives would break out on the body of the orange juice allergic personality, and they actually had it where sometimes the person would switch after they drank, so the hives would break out, and once they switched, the hives would disappear. That's something that would be very difficult to control with your psychology, or if you're just trying to fake it or you're just saying so. One personality was colorblind and the other is not. There's been examples of that. Two personalities have different prescriptions of glasses, so one will higher prescription and one have a lower prescription. Some examples of two different eye colors. Now, I'm not sure. I have troubles researching this one, but I know I've heard it before, and it could be just a gradation between dark blue and light blue, and I've seen that for myself, so maybe that's all that is. So don't take this one as seriously as the rest. I'm not sure if it's an extreme change, like a brown to a blue, but I know anecdotally people that told me that they have changed their eye color. And then different reactions to drugs. So one personality will have a strong effect, one will have no effect. One individual is lazy-eyed and the other individual is not, one of the personalities. So that would be another one that would be very difficult to fake without 100% of believing it and having a physiological reaction to one personality being in control while the other was not. One patient had a blood pressure of 150 over 110 and one had a 90 over 60 when the other person took over. So that one's a little bit more explainable away. I mean, you could just say that one is way more tense and anxious and angry or something, and that would consequently result in higher blood pressure. So that one's not as compelling as some of the examples, but there's lots of examples there. But again, this is, to me, really demonstrates mind over matter, and all of these things make a lot more sense if you take that perspective. And another example for this, and this is Steve Jobs, obviously part of the brain trust that came up with Apple. a book that he read every year of his life, according to many sources that I've heard from. A very interesting book. So it's about yoga. This guy, um, in the story, they talk about people that hadn't ate for many years. So there was one lady that he ran into that hadn't ate for many years, and her explanation of this was pretty interesting. He had people he ran into that he said could manifest diamonds and jewels in their hands. He talked to people that he knew in different dimensions after they died. He met this Luther Burbank, who he was a horticulturist, and he actually came up with different species of plants. And he was talking about how Luther said he would speak to the plants and convince them to change in some situations. So it's not that he was just picking, like he was probably aspects of picking the right candidate for changing the phenological attributes of the plant. But I mean, with this one, there's no thorns on this cactus, and he wanted to do it so that there could be cattle raised in a certain area. And apparently, he said that he could that was part of his process, was to convince the plants that they wouldn't have to have spines on them. And this was sort of an elder in his community, and said that when they wanted to take a picture of him, he wouldn't show up unless the elder would allow it. So they took one picture and there was nothing that showed up, and then he says, "Do you want me to stay there?" And he would show up. A really interesting book. And actually, this guy, when he died, he recited a poem and said that he was going to die. Then he died right on the spot. Really an interesting thing. And he traveled all around the world. Very interesting person. Very seemed very grounded. And we'll take some examples from the book. I think he really reinforces this idea when some of these quotes here. So here's something he said: the more an individual realizes, we say he, but an individual realizes his unity with spirit, the less he can be dominated by nature, by matter. The soul is ever free and it is deathless because it is birthless, and this is something we've talked about too. So because there's no beginning, there's no end. Man is a soul and has a body, rather than a person as we think of our soul inside of our body like it's subservient to it. He says the opposite. When he properly places his sense of identity, so his sense of identity with the soul rather than the body, he leaves behind all compulsive patterns. So long as he remains confused in his ordinary state of spiritual amnesia, he will know the subtle fetters of environmental law. So all the bad things will come to you if you believe that you're a body above a spirit or above a soul. God is harmony, and the devotee who attunes himself will never perform any action amiss. And this is something we're going to talk about later. But we'll leave that just as a quote for now. And one more thing I wanted to say about this is that the ancient Greek word for nature or forms is idios, and that's where we get the word for idea. So it's very closely related. And also, one of the original words for thought is the same as the original word for word. So people talk about abracadabra. With my thoughts, I create. Sort of the same idea. People had a much more open belief of this mind over matter thing back in ancient times. We have another very successful man here, Robert Sharma. So the monk who sold his Ferrari. Obviously, this has sold tons of books. This one, but what he says is kind of consistent with what we're saying so far. Everything is created twice: first in the mind and then in reality. In Western culture, we have this subject-object duality, and me as an English teacher, that's one of the classes I've taught. But as a teacher, there's a lot of languages that don't have this. So there's this separation between one aspect and the other aspect. It's very strong in Western cultures, especially Latin-based cultures. But that's not always the case. There's opposing forces in the sentence where there's others in other languages where that is not there. So, and I think typically those cultures and languages put mind at a much higher responsibility for things that are happening. The thing that you have to mention or keep in mind though when we're talking about this, If you're going to create with your mind, this is your brain, not your mind. Those are two different things. And plus, when you're thinking, you're using this very weakened part of the mind. This is the individualization of the mind. And like I say, the bits per second here is super low, and it's only good at one thing. That really is just at focusing on one thing at one time. That is all this part of the brain, the human part of the brain, that would rationalize. I want to be richer. I want to have more charisma. That all that part of it is the weakest part. So we need to get to these lower levels if we're going to be able to have effect. This reptilian brain, I think, is like sort of like the gut feeling we have. That's why our gut feeling is a lot of time very accurate. And the limbic brain is just an emotional brain. So you don't want to be too emotional, but at the same time, this is closer related to reality than is our ideas about reality, which are kind of put on the lower levels, sort of thinking that they're lesser than. And I didn't explain that very well, but we'll leave that there for now. This is how I want to close. So, with the idea that this is how we see things, we think that miracles make faith. So we need to see Jesus walk on water in order to believe that it's true. But the reality is not actually that. Miracles don't make faith. I mean, they can, but that's not really what it is. Faith makes miracles. So this is kind of paraphrased from the brothers Dostoevsky, and I think this is more the way that would be consistent with understanding the philosophy that we've talked about so far. That's been from Chinese culture, that has been from Western culture, and been from scientific observation as well. So to me, this is the way you have to think of it. Don't think of it like you have to see something miraculous in order to believe these things. Because if you don't believe these miraculous things can happen, that they won't happen. And to some, this might be like, well, there's not really a miracle then. But it is. But you're in more control of it than you think you are. So this is a thought to keep in mind until we talk next. We have a lot more to address to really reinforce some of the important ideas that maybe I didn't explain very well today, that I only alluded to. It's hard to really tiptoe into this world without really forcing you to swim through some really difficult waters. So we're gonna just leave it there for today, and then we'll pick up the next day and try to explain some of the things that maybe weren't explained as well as we need to. Anyway, have a good day. Hope you have a good night. Good day, good night, whatever. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.